wonder from down under!
Released on the 25th of November 1991 for the Neo Geo arcade system, Fatal Fury, or as it's lesser known by, Fatal Fury King of Fighters, is the premier fighting game for the system, as well as SNK's first attempt at a fighting game. Having released several months after Street Fighter II, many had seen the game as a competitor to the genre-defining title. However, series creator Takashi Nishiyama, who was himself the director of the original Street Fighter, had intended Fatal Fury to be more so of a spiritual successor to that. Whereas Street Fighter I placed an emphasis on combos and learning the secret special moves to succeed, Fatal Fury would instead place emphasis on the timing of special moves, as well as the game's storytelling. This is evident as soon as the game starts up. Whereas Street Fighter had a simple eye-catcher of some dude breaking down a wall, Fatal Fury opts to set a scene, with the game's main character looking introspectively over the horizon, followed by a scene of the character arriving through a taxi ride to the fighting tournament they've been looking to take part in. Jumping into the game proper, another improvement from the original Street Fighter can be seen: a full-fledged character select screen. Well, sure, the original Street Fighter allowed you to select Ryu or Ken depending on which side of the arcade board you used, despite the fact that they fought the same anyways. But Fatal Fury instead opts to give you 3 different characters to use, each with different special moves, personality, and backstory, which, granted, was nothing on the 8 playable characters that Street Fighter II had, but you win some, you lose some. Immediately highlighted when you reach the selection screen is the game's main character, Terry Bogard. Even Terry himself is an elaboration upon ideas introduced in the original Street Fighter, as he was directly based on the guy who punched down the wall in the intro of that game. To signify the game's larger focus on plot, Terry naturally has a more developed backstory than anything you saw from Street Fighter, for he had come to this tournament looking for revenge on the tournament holder, Geese Howard, for killing his adopted father Jeff Bogard 10 years prior. Since then, he'd been living on the streets, getting by in his own way whilst receiving training from his master Tung Fu Ru, all in preparation for his fated encounter against Geese. Simply put, Terry is iconic. From his look, to his personality, to his abilities, like the rising tackle or the burning knuckle, they all come together to make him a fresh and eye-catching take on the typical Shoto formula that stands the test of time. Naturally, all of the above would be further elaborated on in later games that he appeared in, but it's neat to look back and see how much of it was established by the first game. Joining Terry on his escapade is his brother, Andy Bogard. Andy witnessed his father's death just like his brother, and has sworn vengeance against Geese as well. But instead of becoming a street brawler, Andy instead aimed to differentiate himself by training to be a ninja, specifically in the Shiranui and Kopoken fighting styles, though he also trained alongside Tung Fu Ru for some time. Andy is often disregarded as being the less cool Bogard brother. A somewhat unfair comparison if you ask me, but I guess to be expected when you're the Luigi of the series. But he certainly stands out well enough to warrant inclusion, particularly with his unique, somewhat long-range fighting style, including moves like the Senaken and the Kuhadan. Lastly, to round out the team, there's Joe Higashi. Not blood related to the Bogards at all, but merely a friend that they met on the way to the KOF tournament, who's a long-time Muay Thai champion that merely wishes to prove himself in the KOF tournament. but is certainly glad enough to help the Bogart brothers on their quest. Man, you can't go wrong with Joe. With his boisterous personality, standout look, and useful abilities like the Bakuretsuken and the Hurricane Upper, he's more than a welcome addition to this game, and the series as a whole. With your character selected, you're then taken to a selection screen where you can choose one of 4 fighters to take on at your leisure. You'll inevitably of course have to beat them all to move on, but the choice in how and when you wish to do it is nice. Starting from the top left, there's Richard Meyer at the Pow Pow Cafe.
Terry Bogard versus Richard Meyer.
Richard's more of a tricky sort of fighter. He doesn't fight with his arms at all, instead using a bunch of flashy kick attacks to get at you, and he'll also hang from the top of the ceiling to avoid your attacks and hit you from there. You'll also see that he's able to lane switch, which allows him to travel to the other side of the field at will. Should he attempt to do so, you can press the punch or kick button to travel along towards him and attack him. Being able to travel between 2 lanes on the battlefield certainly sounds like an interesting concept, but unfortunately its potential here is somewhat limited as only the enemy can engage in it. The player cannot activate the lane switch mechanic on their own. That aside, this isn't a particularly troublesome fight. Richard Meyer himself does not particularly show up often after this game, being relegated to a side character who runs the Pow Pow Cafe, but it's neat when he does show up, I guess. After winning the fight, you'll see another of the game's attempts to have a higher level of storytelling. The game's villain, Geese, will pop in and give you his current thoughts on the player's progress. Pretty neat way of building up his presence before you actually meet him, I think. Anyways, after beating Richard Meyer, you'll then be made to go up against Michael Max.
Terry Bogard versus Michael Max.
Michael Max himself is not particularly noteworthy as an enemy. He doesn't have many types of attacks, he can't jump or attack from there either, as one particular attack of note is his tornado projectile, which itself is very similar to Joe's tornado upper. Little wonder that this character hasn't shown up much outside this game. His stage, on the other hand, there's a fair bit to say about. It's here that I would say it's pretty apparent that they did a lot to make the backgrounds in this game seem lively. This is true of the previous stage as well, where they had the characters in the background actually sing the song that you're hearing as you fight Richard Meyer. But it's here specifically that the player will likely notice all the details about the audience, like how they cheer for you at the end of a round if you win, or hear how either you or Michael Max can be knocked into the background and then they'll knock you back. Another cool feature of the stage is its round transitions. After the end of a round it will change to a different time of day, and the music's pretty damn good too. Certainly not the first or last banger from this game, but certainly a notable one.
Bonus area.
After every couple of stages, you'll be taken to a bonus round. Here you'll do a virtual strong-arm contest against this arcade machine, and you'll have to mash the buttons to try and get the most amount of points. A neat addition, I suppose. And hey, as an added bonus, the game will inform you of one of your possible special moves if you didn't know it already. So there's that.
Terry Bogard versus Kung Fu Roo.
Kung Fu Roo is another one of the tricky fighters. He's already fairly strong in his normal form, with a particularly strong special attack that you need to watch out for, but at any point after hitting him, he can turn into his powered up form, which takes less damage than every other boss in the game, and gets 2 extra powerful special moves, including a spinning attack that launches 2 projectiles in front and behind him. Or he can just go full Crash Bandicoot on you and do a spinning attack that goes full screen. easily the hardest opponent of the first half of the game for sure, and certainly enough for this character to leave an impression and show up in later games. His stage, the Howard Arena, has some neat features too. For its scene transition, it starts to rain on the second round, which is pretty neat, I suppose.
Terry Bogard versus Duck King.
And now we come to the last opponent of the first half of the game, Duck King, and what a character he is. Though a character that's certainly in their infancy here. They have two particular attacks of note, a slide attack that can go under some attacks, and the duck roll attack, which has high priority and will send them to the other side of the lane, whether it hits or lands on block. The guy certainly has an interesting look and a funky tune for his stage theme too, but believe you me, he gets elaborated on a lot further later down the line. But still, as I said, it's cool to look back and see a character in their infancy. Upon beating the first half of the opponents, you'll then be set to go on to the second half, of which you'll fight them all in a set order. First up being Wajai.
Terry Bogard versus Wajai.
Unfortunately, the second half of the game doesn't make the greatest first impression, as Wajai is probably the most second-rate character in the game. He looks pretty much identical to Joe Higashi aside from having a different head model, and he doesn't even have any special attacks in his base form. Only when he drinks some of his special juice does he gain an extra attack, a rushing knee kick that isn't even particularly difficult to deal with. Yeah, perhaps unsurprisingly, this character doesn't show up again too often, until KOF 13, funny enough, where he'd received several new abilities such as performing multiple knee bashes in the air, which would certainly have made him more interesting here, but it is what it is. Well, at least his stage looks pretty nice, I suppose, and has a reference to the game's work in progress title, Real Belt, so that's pretty neat, I suppose.
Terry Bogard versus Raiden.
After Wajai, you then proceed to take on Raiden, and Raiden comparatively makes much more of an impression, being one of Geese's boot, who has the persona of a heel wrestler, and to this end has some nasty tricks up his sleeve, like his signature spray attack. Certainly a bit more of a challenge than Wajai was, and he also has a pretty locking theme too. His stage is pretty neat too, taking place at an amusement park, so all in all, not much to complain about with him.
Terry Bogard versus Billy Khan.
Next after him is the penultimate boss, Billy Kane. Billy is Geese's right-hand man, whom he has counted on to win all the KOF tournaments before, and befitting this title, he's certainly a tough opponent, with a really long range from his cane, which he can use to pole vault towards you to dodge some attacks, or he can even throw at you from a long distance, which will leave him defenseless for a while, but eventually another cane will be thrown in for him to use. Funny enough, this can also happen if you break his cane by throwing him, or doing damage to him otherwise. A tough opponent for sure, but if you've made it this far, you can certainly deal with him. Upon beating Billy Kane, you'll have formally won the King of Fighters tournament, and your player character will be seen celebrating their victory. But of course, it's not over yet. There's one more opponent that you still need to take on after all. And who else would it be but Geese Howard? As you'll quickly learn from taking him on, Geese does not fuck around. Between his overall strength, his signature Reppuken, which basically functions like the Power Wave except it's faster and goes full spring, and his counter moves, which at any conceivable time could just completely nullify your offense. There's no doubt he's certainly a beast to deal with, and well deserving of being one of the most notorious fighting game bosses. But if that wasn't enough to sell you on his intimidating presence, perhaps his stage at the very top of the Howard Building, or his iconic theme song will. And to add insult to injury, as if all of this wasn't bad enough, if you happen to lose against him, instead of just getting the plain old game over screen, Geese will just straight up knock you out of the building. But if you can manage to pull it together and beat him, you'll be the one that does it to him. And that's Fatal Fury. At least the single-player component. Like any good fighting game, Fatal Fury also has multiplayer. As you'd expect, you can pick any two of the free playable characters and duke it out together. However, what you might not have expected is that this game actually has co-op. Yeah, a fighting game from 1991 has this kind of feature that you usually only see in like Mugen or something. But of course, all is not as good as it seems, as you only get to use it for a round at a time before you're then forced to engage in a typical two-player versus match, which then forces the second player to join again afterwards. You also can't use it against Geese because of course you can't. Regardless, for the opportunities you do get to use it, it is pretty fun. Need I mention that the song that plays for this mode is a banger? It notably has this 90s surfer rock tone to it, which can be heard in a few of the game's other songs, and I think it fits the game pretty well. Well, that's everything contained in the game, so what's the best way to play the game? The most notable one to me and the one I would recommend is the one included in Fatal Fury Battle Archives Volume 1 for the PlayStation 2. It's an arcade-perfect port that allows you to change the controls to your liking, and it also includes a fantastic arranged soundtrack which you've been hearing throughout this video. Aside from that, the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo versions of the games are noteworthy, as they allow you to play as the game's bosses in the multiplayer mode. But aside from that, I wouldn't really recommend those versions, as the Mega Drive version lacks a couple of the bosses, and the Super Nintendo version just completely butchers the game's soundtrack. So yeah, wouldn't recommend. In conclusion, Fatal Fury is an interesting game to look back on. Of course, in truthfulness, it's difficult to recommend honestly playing this game over the later games in the Fatal Fury or King of Fighters series, which all play better and have more content and the like, but the first game has its charm and its merits, which certainly warrant its place in fighting game history, both for what it tried to do, and for the fact that it started off such an iconic franchise.